Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, we're going to be ranking every electric type Pokemon in competitive Pokemon. This is to go over the best Pokemon for both singles and VGC, and if you enjoy what you see, make sure you leave a like down below and subscribe for more content like this, and comment your thoughts on the tier list. If you want to stay up to date on videos like these, join the Twitter and Discord. Both of those are easy ways to get up to date on content, as well as just in general to communicate with you guys. And in case you want to go the extra mile, we do have the channel member button down below as well. For a few dollars a month, you can throw your support towards the channel. But with that said, let's get into it. For anyone who's new to the tier list, we do have a few things to go over first, and a little housekeeping. First up, let's go over our rankings. We have the S+ tier at the very top. These are for Pokemon that typically will dominate in either the VGC space, because there's no VGC Ubers and there's no VGC UU and other tiers of the sort. For Natdex AG, because the highest tier Natdex, or for Sword and Shield AG, because of the fact it's the highest tier for Sword and Shield. This would typically be for Pokemon that I would say control the metagame basically. They're extremely influential to a fault, and they're Pokemon that you typically will see running pretty much on every team with really no drawback. The S tiers are for Pokemon that are still really good and competitive, but they're not necessarily just outright dominating a tier. These would be Pokemon, for example, if we were doing a fire type tier list like Ho-Oh, or also including potentially Pokemon that are so good in OU that they would be considered as influential as some of these Ubers were in S+. This would be Pokemon such as on a ground type tier list, Landorus Therian. For the A tier, just for really good OU Pokemon, maybe some really bad Ubers that were banned for some really dumb reason, but otherwise it's mostly for OU Pokemon. This might also include some decent Pokemon in VGC, but it's where you start to see Pokemon that aren't consistently on teams. The B tier is for niche VGC picks, as well as some niche OU picks, or even just Pokemon that are really decent at UU. Maybe we'll get an RU band in here too, just depending on. The C tier is mostly for the RU sort of Pokemon, maybe a really bad UU-mon, maybe a really good NU-mon. D tiers for like the bad RU through PU range. Typically this is where you see Pokemon that are deserving enough to really be used, but they're typically not used on a lot of teams. F tiers for Pokemon that are so bad, but they're either fully evolved and they have to be mentioned somewhere, or B for NFE Pokemon that are noteworthy enough to mention somewhere. So with that said, let's start off with the mascot Pikachu. Pikachu unironically is getting a D tier actually, and it's solely because of the Light Ball item. Light Ball actually makes this thing a pretty decent offensive Pokemon, considering the fact that Pikachu's offenses, when they're both doubled, actually kind of are threatening. You do need to really scout for Pikachu unironically. And while I won't act like this is some like OU monster, it definitely I would say has some low tier merit personally. And I think that as well, if we're going to go into Gmax Pikachu, Gmax Pikachu is also kind of a monster. This has actually seen some really good performance through VGC over the generation. I won't act like this is some massive top cut Gmax mon like a Colossal, for example, or like a Charizard or a Venusaur, but it's honestly had some pretty decent performance. I think I'd be missed to put this anywhere besides B tier. It's definitely still a niche pick, and I won't act like this has ever been a meta Pokemon, but to dismiss how many times this has actually won a tour this gen, it would be pretty disrespectful, considering how this actually does offer some stuff to teams. For example, with the 90 speed tier that Pikachu has, you're actually able, or actually it might even be 95, I'm pretty sure it's 90 though. But basically, with the speed tier that you do have, you're able to actually put pressure on a lot of different box art Pokemon. For example, and it is 90, I did confirm that, you're able to tie Pokemon such as Kyogre and Groudon, which in the restricted formats is actually pretty valuable, considering it's one of those offensive Gmax mons that can just outright remove Kyogre from the game. And unlike something such as Venusaur, it's not weather dependent. On top of this as well, it's just really hard to switch on electric unless you're a ground type this gen, because the only real grass types that are viable, at least to a top tier degree, would be stuff like Amoonguss and Venusaur, which even still, Pikachu has coverage for. I don't know how this mon has such a filthy coverage set, but if we do look into its normal move set, well actually I don't think Pikachu has that for restricted, because bounce is an event move, but even still, you can still go for stuff like Max Strike and get some good damage off, Max Quake as well, and you could take the opponent's hits stronger in that regard. As I said, Grass Knot's great for stuff like the Groudon matchups, as well as Kyogre to a degree, but mostly for Groudon because you just electric move Ogre. The point being though is this does have a lot of good stuff, and that doesn't even get into Pikachu's utility outside of Max, with stuff like Fake Out. So definitely a really strong pick. I would say the regular Pikachu definitely is only able to be as good as it is in VGC because of how good Gmax is though, so I am going to put Gmax a couple tiers higher. Next up is Raichu. This is a legitimate VGC Pokemon as well. Honestly, this is pretty decent, albeit this gen I would say is probably one of Raichu's worst gens that it's had over the generations, and that's not to say that Raichu's like horrible because it does actually have some good utility on teams like Kyogre matchups, for example, where you could pair this with Kyogre and then be able to pressure Pokemon such as Regieleki, since their moves would get drawn straight to Raichu. So this does have some actual merit in my opinion. I'm going to put Raichu in C tier because even outside of this, I do respect Raichu actually as a low tier threat as far as singles goes. While this Raichu isn't some like meta Pokemon, it definitely has some cases where it's been valuable as far as a PU setting, albeit right now it probably isn't, but I think Raichu's utility alone in doubles does put it at least a tier above Pikachu. Next is Alolan Raichu. I'm actually also putting this in C tier. It's decent with Search Surfer, and while this is definitely the worst option in VGC by a considerable amount, I would still say that this is definitely a better option in doubles by a considerable amount. Got banned from PU, and as far as I'm aware, at least it's a not terrible option in NU, albeit I wouldn't act like it's great because it's sitting in the PU ban tier. I do think, though, to be fair, this is mostly just due to the fact that there's a lot of electric types that are actually really viable in VGC right now. If we look at the top 10 non-restricted Pokemon, for example, number 2 is Thundurus, then we skip a few down, 6, 7, 8, and then we get Regieleki. 9, 10 fills out the top 10, but then we get some runner-ups like Zapdos, for example, which is at like 14th. I know that Coco, at least at one point, was on here, but it seems like Coco users have actually fallen off significantly, which is insane. We do have Rotom Heat making the list before Coco, and then Raichu as well, which again, kind of insane to think about. I know that as far as not restricted formats go, we do have stuff like Coco popping up, but in general, I mean, it's one of those things where electric types have been really good this gen. I think they're really good max users, and a lot of them have really good moves to take advantage of stuff outside of max. We do have other stuff like Rotom Wash. If we look at non-restricted Raichu, yep, Coco's up here now, and all of these are just above the 2% mark and not restricted, so there are a lot of competition, and I think that Raichu just in the alone form sadly has to kind of fight a lot of other Pokemon that are more valuable with this, sadly. So yeah, they're both C tier. I just think that this is the singles Raichu you use, and this is the doubles Raichu, basically. Golem Alola, I think this is definitely an F tier electric, sadly. This is mostly just due to the fact that I think that Golem does have a little bit of an identity issue when it comes to how you want to run it, because you do have a few good options. For one, Magnet Pull. Steel Chopping is definitely decent, but in the lower tiers it's never really appreciated, and Golem isn't really viable in higher tiers just because of its typing and speed stat. When we get into Sturdy, for example, it could be a sturdy rocker like regular Golem, isn't 4 times weak to water or grass, and it can actually pressure waters offensively. However, at the same time though, it does lose out on a great immunity in electric, and on top of that as well, Earthquake is just a lot more spammable of a stab. So at least it's competing with that slot now, I guess, with Golem. And then as far as Galvanize goes, yeah, you know, having an electric type explosion is great, but to really guarantee this off, you basically either need Trick Room up, or you really just need to make sure that you have a Focus Sash, or somehow pressure your opponent into switching, which isn't usually the easiest thing to do with this typing, considering the fact that while Electric and Rock offensively is decent, you're gonna get kind of squashed by really anything with Earthquake, and it's not exactly an uncommon coverage move. So I would definitely say that despite everything Golem does have that's a benefit, I think that it's in general just a Pokemon that really doesn't know what it wants to run. I'm going to give it F tier, but I will admit that I might move this up to D tier as the tier list goes on. We'll have to see. Next up, though, we do have Magneton. Now, I did actually get some comments on my first tier list that Magneton was under-tiered, and I think in hindsight, on the Steel tier list, I did under-tier. I think this is honestly, truthfully, just a really high C tier. Probably going to lead the pack as far as C tiers go. I can't really see a ton that are going to be better than this. Magneton offering a Steel-type trapping, and I think unlike Alolan and Golem, this is a lot better at doing so, just solely off the fact that this is a special attacker, and a lot of Steels do end up being more physically oriented. Also, Magneton is definitely a lot better of a choice option, being able to more successfully run a choice scarf and outpace even Pokemon that are around like that 120, 130 mark, or at the very least coming close to tying them. I think it actually just gets outpaced by 130. So the point being is it's able to actually viably run a scarf. Again, really great pivot. This is really decent Mon and UU for PDSP too. So I do want to acknowledge that. In general, though, I will say that the one thing that this does sadly miss is body press, which, unlike its evolution, this does lack. Though it does have a lot of other options in general that do make it still a pretty viable Pokemon, such as just a really strong offensive stab combination, especially with fairies now in the mix, and also pretty decent defensive typing too, since we're going to be on that topic. Electric Steel isn't terrible defensively, while Electric doesn't offer a lot outside of just the Electric Resist. Steel is just a great blanket offensive type and defensive typing, and barring the 4x weakness to ground, it's honestly pretty good. So I'm gonna give this a C tier. Electrode's up next, just F tier, but I'm gonna put it behind Alolan and Golem. This is definitely not a great Pokemon, but I will say that Electrode, weirdly enough, does typically find its way into really low tiers, solely for the fact that it's a really fast, obnoxious screens user, which is something more that I could say it's defined out than low and golem at the very least. But at the same time, though, I will say as well, I don't really think that it's great at that role either. It's just really fast and it's able to click screens, but I wouldn't like that. That's what makes Lecky good in singles, just because it's fast. It's not because it's a good Pokemon, just because it's fast. And to be fair, I will say that even among lower tiers, if we were to look at, let's say, that PU sort of tier, let's say, we could pull up Electrode. Well, actually, Electrode's been in PU, but oh, you know what? This is PU and BDSP. Oh, that's gotta sting. Even still, though, if we were to look at this tier, I would argue that there's actually better screens options in the tier. For example, if we look at stuff like Meganium, I think Meganium actually is a pretty not terrible screens option, and at least it's self-sustain. We do have just other Pokemon. None of these really need sustain, and even still, BDSP, PU, it's not a real tier if we're gonna be honest. Anything below like UU and BDSP really just isn't a real tier anymore. Regardless, though, definitely a F tier Pokemon. The Sui and Electrode, though, is definitely gonna get the D tier again. Similarly to last time with the Grass tier list, this is a really fast option, and unlike Electrode, its stab does actually kind of benefit it, because getting options like even just Energy Ball if Chloroblast doesn't make it into Scarlet and Violet is a really great way to actually pressure grounds that would otherwise pressure electric typing really well. It's now neutral against against grounds, as well as because of the electric typing, neutral against flying now. So its only weaknesses are Bug, Fire, and Grass, which is pretty decent. The typing, weirdly enough, does give it 2 new neutralities, which is really good. Sadly, though, it's a Grass type that can't really switch in on ground options, which is typically what a lot of teams would throw a Grass type on. Though at the same time, I will acknowledge that there are other options around this, such as Levitate users and also just flying types. So it's not a huge deal breaker, but it definitely does hurt a bit. Still, regardless, though, I'm going to give this the D tier. It's just better Electrode. Electabuzz, honestly, it's a pretty cool Violet Electric. Get some good options offensively. However, I am going to give it F tier. Just, it will probably be in the forefront. I will say that Electrode, I think, does, not Electrode, Electabuzz does get a lot of competition just from other electric types, in my opinion. And I think that a lot of people have definitely strayed away from the fact that you would actually enjoy running this as an NFE user. Though at the same time, I do think it's actually one of those Pokemon that's a better screens user than Electrode. Solely for the fact that I think this is a lot better of an offensive move pool than Electrode does. Electrode's move pool is pretty garbage outside of just boom and screens. But regardless, though, I'm going to give it to Electabuzz. It's a pretty decent option, and I think that especially with an ability like Static isn't a Violate option, it's again able to just take advantage of a lot more of those bulky sets than Electrode. So F tier, but better. Jolteon's up next. Jolteon's not horrible, albeit this is definitely like the worst gen that Jolteon's had in a while. It's at least managed to stay in PU, but I would argue this is just worse Raichu. Raichu's electric immunity ability is a good redirection, its coverage is a lot better, and despite being slightly slower in speed, it doesn't really actually hurt Raichu that much, just because the fact that Raichu does have, again, such a good coverage pool, and it's typically a good Life Orb or Scarfmon. I will say, though, that Raichu's offenses being a little lower does hurt it a bit, but at the same time, this has Nasty Plot, whereas Jolteon for setup has, oh, what's that? Is it Work Up? Oh, no, it has Work Up. That's terrible. Definitely a D tier Pokemon. I'm putting it actually right behind Pikachu, though I think these two are pretty interchangeable. I solely think it's just because of the fact that this is decent VGC usage because of the max, that I'm going to put this above Jolteon. Next up is Zapdos. Zapdos is a really strong A tier electric. Honestly, one of the better A tier electrics, and I think it will probably end up being the best. It's great in singles as a defensive option with Static and Boots, or you could run this as a really good Rain offensive option with Thunder and Hurricane, and it absolutely does maul teams. It's really hard to switch it on offensive Zapdos, just specifically because it finally has Hurricane. On top of this as well, as far as VGC goes, it's actually a pretty good option with stuff like Tailwind. Well, actually, I do need to double check if it gets Tailwind, I'll be honest, because it's one of those things that I feel like it's pretty implied that Zapdos gets Tailwind considering its usage, but I don't actually know if it runs it. It doesn't even look like it runs Tailwind, so I'm going to assume it doesn't get it. Even if it does get it, though, it looks like Zapdos just trends a lot more offensively in VGC this gen. Yeah, it doesn't look like it gets Tailwind. Okay, that's fine. Even still, though, it looks like it gets a lot of max options. It's typically running Hurricane, Thunderbolt, and Heat Wave, though occasionally it does run stuff like Rising Voltage, which I'm not sure why it runs that. Isn't Rising... Oh, you know what? No, it's... Rising Voltage isn't the one that matters. it's the target that's grounded. It's not the user that's grounded. Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Regardless though, definitely still a really terrifying max option just because it not only sets its own terrain, but it also boosts its own speed. And the terrain could be in theory useful for clearing stuff like Rillaboom or Finny terrain, or even if they're not on the field that is, or also for clearing Psychic terrain, which is pretty good for allowing other partner Pokemon to use priority. So I definitely do think this has a lot of good options. Definitely a strong A tier. Next up is Lantern. Lantern's pretty decent in my opinion. 2 immunities, really decent typing. I'm definitely going to put this in the D tier. I'm putting it at the very top of D tier right now. Lantern's typically a really decent bulky water as far as just lower tiers go. You're able to typically utilize this in like an NUPU setting because it's a really good bulky pivot. It's slow enough to where you're going to underpace teams and bring in your offensive Pokemon. Great heal bell option. I do think this is definitely a really strong offensive piece as well. 76 might not seem like a lot, but when you get water, ice, and electric options offensively, and you have a pretty decent enough bulk stat, you could actually make this work in a weird degree. It's offensive for a bulky Pokemon, I would say, especially for the PU tier. I think that it's one of those things where you could just throw an Assault Vest on Smon, or just run Spit with leftovers and throw Heal Bell on, and just start getting a lot of options offensively. The coverage does really tailor itself though, and again, I think that the fact this is 2 immunities, you do kind of need to play around it, or you could in theory end up healing Lantern accidentally, which especially on Assault Vest sets is amazing. And I know a lot of people typically do just assume you're running Bulbasaur, but Water Absorb is pretty decent too, depending on your team comp. As far as PU goes, there's a lot of Pokemon that are just really weak to water, and you could typically use that to your advantage, whether they're weak to water because of Scald Burns or they're weak to water because of their actual typing. Lantern could definitely function as a good switch into that as well. Definite D tier. Ampharos is up next. I'll be honest, I think Ampharos is pretty garbage. However, the Mega is really decent. Ampharos, the only real benefit is the fact that it could, in theory, bait not Mega Evolving and go for a Static Para. So with that in mind, I'm going to put it at the front of F tier. It's also just better Electabuzz, if we're going to be honest, despite the fact that it's a lot slower. I think it has a lot better of a coverage pool, as well as the fact that it has options like Cotton Guard, for example, to actually help defensively set up, which is pretty decent. This is a Pokemon I think that down the line will get body pressed. However, for now, we don't really have it. It's a great Chicken Breaker though. It also gets a Cleric option weirdly enough through Heal Bell. Mega Amp though gets top of C. The Dragon Electric typing and the fact that it is even slower than Ampharos is really genuinely amazing. Mold Breaker as well is really decent just as an offensive ability. This can get around stuff like Volt Absorb Pokemon or Lightning Rod users. On top of the fact that as well, it can go for stuff like Thunder Wave on, well, let's say in doubles, for example, Mold Breaker could be in theory a great option on Lightning Rod in general with your single target electric options, which is really valuable, or even just going for Toxic on Magic Guard or Magic Bounce users. Well, specifically Magic Bounce users is really valuable there as well. So Mega Ampharos is definitely a solid C tier electric. Raikou, definitely B tier. We're putting it above GX Pikachu, solely for the fact that Pikachu Gmax, it is still a Pikachu at the end of the day, even if it's not unviable. Raikou is a decent offensive option. I would personally actually frame this as a budget version of Zapdos, even though they are wildly different. It's more so just the fact that Raikou typically ends up always like a couple tiers below Zapdos as far as an offensive electric goes, as far as a bulky electric goes, because while they do different things to achieve these goals, Raikou typically would offer more Calm Mind variants to offensive sets, and it would be subtoxic sets for defensive roles, whereas Zapdos typically doesn't really run either of those. I will say that it does in theory offer the same sort of things to your team, just off of a different route, if that makes sense. It's similar to, I would say, like a Suicune versus Finny comparison. They both run Calm Mind sets, they both run more just blanket defensive sets, but they do them very differently. And that's why I would argue that Suicune, in a certain way, just for a lot of teams, would offer a budget Finny, just very differently. Because even still, Suicune does offer its own immunity around status, being through Restock sets. Finny's is just through raw terrain. And in that similar sort of fashion, while again done differently, I would argue is the Raikou Zapdos comparison. Zapdos definitely would be a lot better of an offensive option when you're throwing on a rain team, whereas Raikou could never really compete with a rain Zapdos. And as far as defensive sets, Zapdos also would be better because it's pressure with reliable recovery. Raikou can't really compete with that because its reliable recovery is rest. So I still think that Raikou is a pretty decent option. It's great in BDSP, it's great in singles. I just don't think that it really holds a candle to Zapdos. B tier. Manectric's up next. Manectric's terrible. However, it does have Lightning Rod, which is honestly pretty decent. However, in my opinion, this is just worse Jolteon. Well, actually, no, I'm going to put it on par with Jolteon. I'm putting it right above solely for the fact this is Lightning Rod, which is a redirection immunity. But the fact that it's a lot slower and a little less offensive definitely does hurt. At the same time, though, the coverage is at least a little bit better, with stuff like Overheat being pretty decent, just as another strong offensive option. So I'm going to put them both in D tier. Truthfully, it's kind of mute which one's better or worse, but the
The redirection, I think, at least does give this a little bit of a hand over Jolteon, but they're both kind of terrible, to be honest. Mega Manectric, though, I'll be honest, Mega Manectric actually is a pretty solid Mega still. This is one of those things that I think that Mega Manectric, weirdly enough, kept up the power creep. This is a Pokemon that, thanks to Megas in the Natics tier still having hidden powers, is actually pretty viable. It even has some weird viability in OU, weirdly enough, on certain teams, albeit it's extremely niche. I'm giving Mega Manectric actually a solid B tier. This is one of those things where I know a lot of the Draft League viewers watching this are probably going to be very confused by this, because typically a lot of Natics Draft Leagues ban moves like Hidden Power and Pursuit because they were cut, and if the Pokemon were in theory introduced to Sword and Shield, those moves would probably have not been allowed on them. But the Natics metagame tiers in Smogon actually take a very different approach, and because we're allowing all the Pokemon, we're also allowing all the moves there. And I do think that this is actually a pretty terrifying option in that regard, because you do still keep your options to handle the top tier ground types. For example, if we do look at the Natics UU tiering, and we look at the ground types this is meant to have coverage for, so if like a Powdon can get Hidden Power Iced or Grassed, that's really actually, you probably run Grass in UU because you do have Swampert as a UU ground type. Though at the same time, you could make a case for running Ice for the Nidoking matchups. However, at that point, I would honestly just click Overheat. Nidoking's not bulky enough to really justify Hidden Power towards it. The point being, though, is I do think that Mega Manectric is actually really decent. The speed tier as well is also really good, considering if we look at the Natics UU tier, the only two Pokemon faster are other electric types, being Regieleki and Zeraora. And the thing is, though, is that Mega Manectric having Intimidate does offer a lot to a team as well in that regard. It helps weaken the other physical attackers, which this tier has a lot of. Pokemon such as Croak, for example, which you could, in theory, after a KO, just bring in Manectric, Intimidate it, and then switch out. For Pokemon that you wouldn't necessarily have to switch out against, though, you do have options, for example, like Mega Altaria if it's Dragon Dance. Well, actually, no, you'd still switch on that. You would actually probably switch on a lot of these, to be fair, but even still, just a matter of keeping initiative for a team, which is also very valuable in this gen. So, solid B tier in my opinion. Next up, Plusle and Minun, these both get F tier, and they're both actually going to be at the bottom. These have absolutely no singles viability, and I would never actually justify running these in doubles either. These are two Pokemon that you would really run strictly for the fact to say that you did it. The one saving grace is that, oh wait, they have Lightning Rod? Okay, actually, I can't lie, I'm putting them, no, they're still below Electrode. Because at least Electrode has its speed viability. I think at this point, you're just really trying to run a team that's saying, I'm running bad Pikachu. And the answer is yes, you are running bad Pikachu. That 5 base speed isn't making a difference. Your offense is significantly worse. And you have basically the same utility. It's just worse Pikachu. Both of them are F tier. Luxray's up next. Honestly, Luxray's pretty cool. Luxray gets some options, for example, like Guts that can help a lot offensively, as well as Intimidate, so you could just be a budget Manectric at that point. This is definitely one of those like very bad electric types in practice, though. I'm gonna give it F tier, but I'm gonna put it right above. Electabuzz, because at the very least, this doesn't really need a Violate to be a viable Pokemon. And unlike something like Alolan Golem and Electrode, they don't have really bad identity issues as far as their competitive potential. So definitely gonna put it in F tier. Next up, though, we do have everybody's favorite little rat, Pachirisu. Pachirisu is actually pretty decent. We've seen this thing obviously top cut through VGC and Station Park, winning his title. But even still, I don't even think that's a necessary exclusive case. I think that Pachirisu does offer a lot of tools that could, in theory, be valuable in another restricted metagame. For example, with stuff like Super Fang that this mon just natively gets through level up, as well as the potential for screens with Light Screen at the very least. You also do get stuff like Nuzzle for speed control, as well as Thunder Wave. Momentum gaining through U-Turn. You get options. I think you get Helping Hand in this Pokemon. Yeah, you do get Helping Hand. So you do get a lot of options actually as far as making this Pokemon viable. I will say though that I don't think a Pachirisu will ever have the top tier success, well, the like world championship success that it did again, but I think that you could in theory make a case this is actually a potentially viable doubles Pokemon in a very low sense. However, I'm definitely going to put this in the D tier, and I'm going to put it at the very bottom of D tier solely for the world champ difference. But even still, I do think this in theory could actually replicate a world championship success solely off of the fact that it says Helping Hand plus Super Fang, because Super Fang is just a really good way to really break a lot more defensive teams. And should the meta ever end up adopting a more defensive meta again, I think a Pachirisu would legitimately have a case. So we'll put it in D tier. Next up is Magnezone. Honestly, this is a really strong A tier. I'm kind of unsure which one to put higher. I'm going to put Zapdos higher solely for the fact that it has a lot more doubles viability, but Magnezone is still a really good singles monster, and I think it's slightly better in singles than Zapdos, but they're pretty uncomparable. They do astronomically different things. Magnezone's best role is typically to trap steel types as well as just pressure teams with analytic sets, whereas Zapdos is typically meant to just be a really good blanket wall or a blanket offensive piece. But Magnezone does have a lot going for it, and I think its generation, despite the hidden power loss, Magnezone at the very least has held up a lot. Because of the fact that you do have options like Iron Defense and Body Press, which is able to pressure a lot of steel types such as Ferrothorn that would otherwise be neutral to your electric stab. So I definitely do think that Magnezone is, in my opinion, an absolute monster. It typically gets better the stronger the steel types are that are in the tier, barring Heatran, of course, because Heatran's a fucking demon. But even still, I would say that it would be pretty insane to not put Magnezone in A tier. This mon is held up through several generations, and it only gets better, in my opinion. Electivire's garbage. This is another one of those identity issue mons. I'm putting it right above Electabuzz, though, solely for the fact that despite Electabuzz being faster, which is, in my opinion, more valuable, Electivire's ability, at least as an electric community, which is pretty decent. On top of the fact as well, it's just a lot wider of a move pool, and at least for physical sets, is a lot more offensive than Electabuzz is, considering Electabuzz only has like 83 attack, and they both have the same special. So I don't really think the speed buff matters at that point when it just hits so much worse as far as Electabuzz goes. And typically, you would be able to run this defensively, sure, but it's still, again, not really favored for that because on a lot of defensive mons, you're running Boots this gen over a Violet. So they're both F tier. They're both pretty interchangeable. Rotom's up next. Regular Rotom, I'm actually going to put in the D tier. And as far as the other forms go, I'm going to go over them all afterwards, but I'm going to go over all these at the same time very briefly because they all basically do the same thing. But Rotom is a little differently, and I solely think it's the fact that Rotom's speed is slightly better, which might not seem like a huge factor, but it actually does matter. Getting at 90 gap is actually pretty big, especially if we consider how low tiers typically function. They have a lot of 90s in their faster range, or at least in their top cut for a viable speed tier range, I should say. Not only this, but despite Rotom's slightly worse offenses, I do think that Electric Ghost is a pretty decent offensive typing, so I'm going to put it in D tier. Also, Rotom base can't really function as well defensively speaking. You typically want to run one of the forms for that, just because the huge gap in each of the defenses being a 30 lower in each is pretty harmful. So we're definitely going to put it in the D tier. As far as the other forms go, we're going to go with Fan first. Fan is definitely going to be the weakest of these. I think the Electric Flying is pretty garbage. However, I will say, at least specifically, well, let me rephrase that. Electric Flying is pretty decent, but when you're not getting Hurricane, it's pretty garbage. On top of this as well, the Levitate ability really offers absolutely nothing. Definitely the worst of the bunch, but I will say this gen did make it a lot more viable. It's a decent-ish enough low tier option as far as defog goes. And that's strictly because the fact that it could just be, in theory, a budget Zapdos thanks to stuff like Pain Split, Defog, Volt Switch, and Air Slash, or just switching out Air Slash for Toxic. I won't act like this is amazing, but it's, again, just budget Zapdos typing alone carries. D tier. Rotom Frost. We're putting Rotom Frost, actually, we're going to put it pretty high. I'm putting it right below Pikachu. This is a solid D tier option. Being able to handle the ground types offensively is pretty decent, just off of stab alone. Blizzard, sadly, though, is your offensive option. It's not Ice Beam. So in the Hurricane case, I think it would have mattered a lot more because low tier could have valued a lot more of a hit rain team. Low tier Hail is pretty garbage, though, so I don't think that Rotom Frost really actually wants to be on a Hail stack like that. Whereas Rotom Vent could have, because a lot of teams could have really appreciated the Electric Flying typing. Hail isn't really going to appreciate another Ice type. So we're going to put it in D tier. This mon needed Ice Beam. Next up is Rotom Mo. Rotom Mo is honestly a really solid option. I shouldn't Rotom Mo a ton, but this is legitimately a really good C tier option. Similarly to Electrode, it has no real option to be a legitimate ground switching, because in theory, if any sort of ground type went for like a Smackdown, for example, or Gravity, this no longer is a legitimate ground counterplay outside of just outpacing them and hoping. Though in that regard, Rotom Mo is one of the best Rotoms for Scarfing if you're trying to look for that sort of regard. It's also one of the better options for Nasty Plot sets because typically Heat and Wash do opt for more defensive roles despite having the ability to run Plot. So yeah, Rotom Mo does have at least that niche carved out for itself pretty well. Definite C tier. Rotom Heat. I will say that I think a lot of people are going to expect Rotom Heat in the A tier, but I'm actually going to put it at the top of B. And I'm putting Wash here as well, and I'm putting Wash slightly below. I think that you could make a case for Wash being higher in BDSP, and I would legitimately agree. I think in BDSP, Rotom Wash is the better option. However, I think in singles this generation, I think in Sword and Shield, both for singles and doubles, Rotom Heat is adopted a slightly better role. This is typically sought after in doubles strictly for the fact that it is a slightly better Zacian counter, and as far as singles goes, it's pretty decent as far as just the fact that it's a fire type that can run boots, and it's also immune to ground despite having a 4x weakness to it. So I do think it is slightly better. These two are truthfully very interchangeable for me. If you're running PvP, Wash is definitely better. However, I think in every sort of sword and shield metagame, he is better. And I think in Nat decks, they're both pretty interchangeable, to be honest. Neither's really better or worse there. I would say that Wash is a slightly better matchup in a lot of Nat decks teams. But even still, I think it's such a negligible difference as far as the Rotoms go that I would still say that he definitely would overall rank higher here. Next up is Arceus Electric, definitely S tier. It's truthfully, despite the fact that you could run in theory Bolt Beam with perfect coverage with Calm Mind and Recover, it's sadly one of the worst electric types. One of the worst Ubers. You're typically not really running Arceus Electric actually as an Ubers option, and if we pull up Arceus types as far as the tier goes for tier not Dex AG, we pull up the viability rankings even. We can look, and Arceus Electric I don't even think is actually ranked on here. But we can pull it up just for semantic. It's actually C-. It's higher than I thought. Even still, it doesn't really, well, it's just flat C2. They don't have a C-. But even still, this is tiered with Pokemon like Excadrill and Groudon, which at that point, it's basically an unviable Pokemon. As far as a lot of electric types in the upper tier, there's not a lot that actually are viable. Aleki is around as viable. It's in the D tier, which C and D are basically as viable. But really the only electric type I'm actually seeing that is viable here is Zekrom, and it's strictly because of its electric dragon, and it's just such a damning offensive type for a lot of matchups, because dragon helps out a lot more valuable matchups for stuff like Zygarde Complete, or any dragon type that's resisting electric. It's just not a great type in Ubers, and I think despite the fact that it could in theory Calm Mindset, you're just better off running a lot of other Calm Mind Arceus that can get still pretty perfect coverage. For example, if I want to run an Arceus with a good stat plus Calm Mind Ice coverage, why not run Ground, which is one of the best Arceuses you can run. It has a lot better matchup presence, and Ground Ice is still pretty damning offensively, while covering a lot of the tier better for super effective versus neutral. So Arceus Electric has a lot of competition. I know a lot of people are going to mention the Bolt Beam thing. I did want to explain why I didn't think it was a valuable argument for Arceus in this tier. Definitely S tier. Zebstrika, pretty terrible, but I will say, if nothing else, this does at least have 2 immunities, which is pretty good. And Lightning Rod, unlike the Lantern, it's a redirect, which is pretty cool. It's still definitely an F tier, but I will say it's definitely at least higher on the F tier. I'm actually going to put it above Zebstrika solely for the fact this is also pretty fast as far as electrics go. Actually, no, I'm gonna put this actually right above Manectric in hindsight, and it's solely for the fact that I put Manectric and Jolteon here because they're redirects, and this is 2 immunities, which is pretty valuable. Actually, has 3 immunities in theory, but immunities to electric and grass because 2 of the abilities to electric immunity, and typically Lightning Rod would be a lot better here anyway because the speed is so good you don't really care about boosting it. And this is such a special attacking heavy Pokemon, you'd actually want to boost the special attack really heavily with Lightning Rod. So that's probably your best immunity here, but even still, I do think Zebstrika is basically just another reskin Manectric. Molga is pretty terrible. I'm sorry, Zeke, I know you're a channel member. I gotta do it to you. I'm kidding. Electric flying typing is actually not terrible. I'll put it in the D tier. Static's also pretty cool, and weirdly enough, this thing having the 103 speed, I would argue that this is more viable than a lot of the F tier electrics. I don't know if people are really ready to have that conversation, but it's a good pivot. It's fast too. Gets options like knock off utility U-turn as well for a nice pivot against grounds. I would legitimately say this is at least fringe F tier, but I think it's at least better enough. I think the only case you can maybe make is Ampharos, but even still, I think that Ampharos is just a lot really slow. And I think that as far as bulky electric clerics go, Lantern's just objectively better. So with that in mind, I'm comfortable enough making the tiering. People might be really upset about that one. I don't really think it's that out there. I think as far as Pika clones go, it's one of the better ones, weirdly enough, and it's solely because of static and motor drive, because weirdly enough, it's one of those things where either it's an immunity, which will damn you for pivoting, or it's static, which will damn you for contact, and boots in this actually do help it a lot. I'm gonna give it D tier. What the heck? Jolt on Galvantula's up next. This is a solid one. I'm putting this right below Magneton in the C tier. I will say that being just having boots in general, it's a double-edged sword. It in theory helps Galvantula, but at the same time though, it does hurt a lot for webs teams not being able to anymore actually be harmed by webs, which kind of sucks, honestly. The fact that you can't really benefit off the speed drop from webs because 5 of the opponent's Pokemon are running heavy duty boots is pretty bad. Still really good offensively specs though, and Grass Bug is weirdly, Electric Bug is weirdly enough good offensively because Bug is able to cover the grass matchups for Electric, and Electric's able to cover the flying ones. I would say this is pretty decent combo. It does help a lot with Thunder matchups too, so we'll give it C. Electros, it's an electric type with an immunity. This actually has no weaknesses. Solely for that alone, as well as the fact this does have a lot of good coverage options. As I've mentioned on the channel before, I've done a lot of draft league here. And there have been so many drafts in this meta where for Galadex specifically, if I took Galadex and I solely added Electros to it, there are a lot of team comps I actually do think this would be a viable Pokemon with. I'm going to actually put it pretty high in the D tier too. I'm putting it above Zipstrika. This immunity I think is pretty decent, and the fact this has a lot of options like coil sets, for example, which you could take advantage of physical sets with knockoff. You get stuff like Thunder Punch, which on a coil set would be pretty decent. And then as far as fourth move goes, you get stuff, for example, like Acrobatics, which could be good for the grass matchup. You get stuff like Aqua Tail for ground matchup. And even as far as special sets go, you used to get stuff like Giga Drain and Grass Stomp for ground. You get stuff like Discharge, which is a great electric option. Dragon Pulse for dragon types, which would still resist your stab. It's pretty valuable coverage in this sort of case. Volt Switch for pivoting. U-Turn for pivoting too, similar to the Emolga case. It's great to pivot on grounds. I do think this is a legitimate option. Its best set would probably be either Coil Lefty's 3 attacks, or it would probably be an AV set meant to run like U-Turn and then 3 special options. I think both would be pretty good here though. Easy D tier. Stunfisk. Stunfisk is actually a PU monster, and it's one of those mons that I know a lot of people typically would be like, oh, you know, Stunfisk is garbage. It's a really slow electric, and it's weak to ground. And it's also a ground type that's weak to ground matchups, which a lot of the PU tier has. It's something that actually does really enough typically carve out a niche in like the PUZU metas. It's a great rocker, it's a decent pivot. This has cool utility options like Pain Split, for example, as well as Foul Play to handle physical setup mons. Obviously stuff like Yawn to force switches, Sucker Punch is decent enough priority, but typically you don't run it. I do think that this has options. Reflect type also is kind of cool depending on what common Pokemon are being ran if they have cool typing. I'm going to give this a D tier. I'm putting it above a Molga and Pachirisu at the very least. I think this has enough of a niche despite not currently being tiered in PU. It's historically had a lot of tiers where it's been PU, and I think it does have enough of a presence to where I could actually get this being a Pokemon that would be run even right now in PU. For example, if we're looking at some top tier Pokemon on the tier, let me actually just for sake of pull up a definitive viability, even though I can kind of scan through here and look at what's viable and not. If we look at the top Pokemon, I would say this is pretty decent as far as context switching for stuff like Scrafty, for example, if it's going to go for Drain Punch and Knock. Decent Helmet Mon too for stuff like Togedemaru, which would otherwise, it's one of the better Pokemon in the tier currently, and I think it's a great helmet switching for this. Same for Aggron, it's in my opinion a pretty decent switching despite that having Earthquake as coverage. If we look through the tier even, is Stunfisk even listed as a viable Pokemon? I'm pretty sure it is. But I would need, yeah, it's actually listed as a viable Pokemon even. So I don't even feel bad about the case. Yeah, I think it's decent. Thundurus, okay, this might actually be a bit of a hot take. But weirdly enough, I'm actually going to put Thundurus in the S+. This is going to need a lot of explaining though, so do not mash in the comments, bear with me. I understand this is a pretty garbage Pokemon in singles right now. It's one of those like Yu-Gi-Oh! Fringe Pokemon, and historically it's even been RU at a couple points this gen. I understand that. But as far as, actually, holy shit, it's UUBL? I know there were metas when this was RU. Maybe I'm thinking Ethereum. Let me know down below. I might have genuinely been wrong in that one. I know for a fact one of the Thundurus did at one point reach RU. The point being, though, is I do actually think this is an amazing Pokemon in doubles. Thundurus, historically even, and I do need to go into historically here. I know I'm not tearing off of that. I am just mentioning it to illustrate a point of how controlling this Pokemon has been every generation in doubles. Thundurus, since its introduction, has been one of the best prankster Pokemon you could typically run. It's up there with Pokemon like Whimsicott in my opinion for just general support, and peak Liepard when it was running assist metas. But Thundurus in general is a really damning support option. It's one of those things that really got a perfect typing, a great speed tier, so even on non-prankster sets, you were able to still run this Pokemon viably. It has great offenses in both physical and special, so it's a little unpredictable in that regard, and it has a great setup to boot for both of them. Bulk up sets with stuff like, for example, you get stuff like Knockoff on physical sets and Superpower and Thunder Punch, pretty decent. On plot sets, you get stuff like Grass Knot, Focus Blast, Thunderbolt. So again, pretty decent. You still even on physical sets get a Flying Stab, which typically a lot of people don't really look into, but you get Fly, which is great. As far as this meta goes, that's really valuable as well, because on Defiant builds, which is great for all the Intimidate spam from mons like Landorus, Incineroar, etc., that would otherwise fuck over a lot of physical attackers. And Thundurus takes advantage of it and Dynamaxes and will destroy teams off of this, because you can get the advantage from the attack boost your opponent now provided you at +1 with. You still, on like a contrary set, wouldn't be lowering your own offenses with your own Dynamax setup, which is amazing for it. You get Fly for your Airstream boost. You get at least the Electric Trade boost for partner Pokemon so they can't fall asleep to stuff like Spore, albeit it doesn't really affect Thundurus a ton. It's still valuable for the partner, at least with the Spore argument, because Amoonguss has a ton of usage this gen. Not only this, but it's a fast Pokemon that boosts with Airstream that cannot be weakened by Thunder Wave spam. It's also a Pokemon that is a great utility option this gen, which I haven't even gotten to how Thundurus performs with utility this gen, because it's actually one of the best options. I would argue that this is in the big three with Grim and Whim for support this gen. And personally, I think, again, it rivals them very confidently. This is great with stuff like Scary Face and Thunder Waves for just speed control aspects. Typically, you don't really run Thundurus as a screen support option, but that's fine because you typically run it with just speed control and then offensive moves, and that's all you really need for this Pokemon to be a demon. Though, if you do want to look into Thundurus' utility, may I suggest the move Eerie Impulse, which is a great way to lower the opponent's special attack. It lowers the attack by 2, so typically this is great against a lot of special G-Max mons like Charizard and Kyogre, for example, if, let's say, you don't have a way to directly kill them through Max, especially if you're worried about weakness policy. I know there were a lot of weakness policy Zards that were popping up, so it is a legitimate thing I think that does deserve potential to counterplay around. So I do think that Thundurus Incarnate is a legitimate S+. I cannot really think of actually a Pokemon that rivals this in doubles, especially for how well it's kept on power creep. Even through nerfs to stuff like Prankster no longer working on dark types, this has still found a way to really keep up and to still become a monstrous Pokemon, despite the fact that one of, if not the best Pokemon of all time in VGC is the dark type, despite the fact that we have several other top tier dark types like a Veltal and Grimstar on VGC that still are in the top 10, I would argue. Well, a Veltal in top 10 for restricteds, but at the very least it's still obnoxiously good anyway. The point being is I do think Thundurus Incarnate is the legitimate S+, and I cannot see a way without like a legitimate just stat drop or move cut that this Pokemon would never actually be in that. Easy S+. Thundurus Therian though, solid electric community, great offensive Pokemon. This gets a solid B tier. I will say this is top of B for sure. It has some decent OU viability. It's a really good breaker. The speed tier is able to outpace a lot of common 100s, which is great. And the 145 special attack is nothing to sneeze at. I think, though, that typically having your own boots instead of more offensive options like Z moves, which if this was in a Z metagame, I would argue this is a lot better. But even still, just power creep caught up to it in the Z metagame for Nat X. Specifically, if we were ranking off a Gen 7, I think this would maybe have a low A tier argument. I think in this gen, though, sadly, a lot of power creep caught it. Easy B tier. Zekrom's easy S, top of S. I think solely for the fact that Zekrom is such a niche Pokemon in VGC. If it had a lot more of a presence, which sadly it's just the fact that a lot of restricteds, I think, just outclass it. And as far as whether it's Series 12, where you could only run 2, typically you were running one of Groudon, Ogre, Zacian, and Calyrex as one of your restricteds. Maybe weird team comps were running like a dual stuff. For example, I ran Lunala Zekrom just to be funny. Didn't really think it was going to do great though. But typically you're running at least one of those 4, being Zacian, Dual Weather, or Ogre, or Calyrex Shadow. And then from there you're building into something like, for example, a Duskmane, not a Duskmane, a Solgaleo, or an Yveltal, or even just one of the other 2 I mentioned. You do have a lot of other options too, even for niche picks that I think still at least rival, if not outclass Zekrom, stuff like Dialga and Lunala, for example. So I do think Zekrom sadly just has a lot of competition. It does offer a lot to a team though. This is an amazing Dragon Dance Electric. It's great in Ubers. It's just not S+ territory in my opinion. Next up, we do have Heliolisk. Solid C tier, actually. I'm putting this right above Magneton. Great choice specs user in low tiers. Water immunity is great. Glare support also is so damning offensively, and this is a great option on weather teams offensively too, because it's not just a great rain option that is able to recover in rain and be a great water immunity. It's also great on sun and getting a nice damage boost. And if you're running a tier that allows Sandveil, it's at least cheeky in that, but I wouldn't really run this on sand when you could run this on sun and rain and be so much more damning. Rain as well, despite not getting the offensive boost that Solar Power gives it, does have Thunder to make up for, which is still a pretty convincing option to run it on Rain, just because it's a lot more spammable of an electric attack now. The point being is it's a monster C tier. The Dene, one of the worst Pika clones ever, is basically, in my opinion, just does what Pachi does and does what Emolga does, but worse. The abilities are a lot less valuable, considering the fact that its best option is Cheek Pouch for offensive, which it doesn't really care about. Still gets Super Fang, but just run Pachirisu, which gets an actual immunity. It still gets options like U-turn and Volt Switch. Just run a Molga if you want to get that pivot that's over 100 speed, especially because the Molga is also faster and it gets a better defensive ability for that regard. I'm putting Dedenne in the F tier. I'm actually going to put it right below Electrode. It's better than Puzzle Minor at least, because I do think that Cheek Pad's legitimately viable, and the support that it gets is a little better. Also, the Ally Switch argument, you can never tier it below the twins because of that. Vikavolt up next. Honestly, again, another offensive monster. Just better Galvantula in my opinion. I'm actually going to put it a couple higher though. I do think that this is a Pokemon that's definitely carved out a nice low tier niche. I will say that I think that Rotom-Mow, despite also being an NU electric, is definitely a lot more viable in higher tiers than Vikavolt would be. But Vikavolt is one of those Pokemon that I know it's not currently an NU, but it's carved out a niche consistently enough. Actually, no, I'm going to put it below Helio at the very least, because Helio is a Pokemon that's a legitimate NU threat. Vikavolt has historically, though, been a pretty good, even just through this generation, despite not currently being a good NUPU sort of Pokemon. It's great with defensive sets, good pivot, it's good bulky electric in general for the tier. And it has actual self-sustain, which is pretty good, as well as the immunity through its ability. I do think that Vikavolt's actually a pretty decent option here. I will say though, in hindsight, I'm actually going to move up Lantern specifically, because I'm noticing that this C tier is having a lot of electrics that have historically been, even, like not just in past generations, this generation specifically, been really decent in singles. And I'm also going to move up specifically Raichu, just because of its doubles viability in certain metagames. The rest I think is fine. I just did need to make that audit a bit, because I was realizing there was a decent difference in Lantern and Raichu's quality compared to the rest of the tier list. I did want to address that at the very least, because I didn't want to leave such a glaring gap, because Lantern I think is actually a pretty decent option. Again, the dual immunity, and it's dual immunity to two very common types, being electric, which is common coverage, and water, which is a common stout. So I did want to acknowledge that. Anyway, next up is Oricorio. If this was around, this would actually be a decent electric option, and I think it would just be a better version of Rotom Fan and Emolga in doubles. This would be a great Dynamax option, actually, with stuff like Quiver Dance, for example. Not Quiver Dance, Dancer being a great way to copy dance moves. For example, if we were to look into what common moves are actually being run for dances, we do have stuff, for example, like Swords Dance, which is run a lot on more offensive Pokemon. Though this wouldn't really matter a ton. I think the biggest one, truthfully, would be Quiver Dance. Which Quiver Dance would be decent. You compare this with Volcarona and run Rage Powder, and just then in theory just run Quiver Dance sets plus Dancer Oricorio, go for max Airstream and boost your speed further while you're then redirecting the Rage Powder hits, so then you don't have to take a physical hit on Oricorio. I do think it could actually be a legitimate mon that you could make a case for. It also gets other cool support options like Tailwind, for example. Calm Mind as well, Baton Pass. You could actually make this a really filthy Baton Pass Pokemon. And I think it's one of those cases where in VGC this might actually have merit for once as being a good Baton Passer. But I don't think it's great. It's niche enough though, and there's actually been weirdly enough some historical evidence of Oricorio doing work in doubles, specifically this form, albeit it's always been in a niche setting. So I do think that with that in mind, I wouldn't exactly dismiss it. It could weirdly enough be a good Dynamax option, and it gets some cool utility too. It's stuff like Feather Dance, so I'm gonna give it C tier. Bottom of seat though, but it's still C tier. Silvally Electric, garbage Silvally typing. The only reason I'm putting it at the top of F is because it can get Bolt Beam. That's really it. Even still, it's not even able to get Bolt Beam too highly because Silvally, actually no, it does get Ice Beam. Okay. Even still though, just Bolt Beam, it's just shitty Arceus Electric, and I've already made the case where this is not a great Arceus typing. So Silvally gets it just solely because it's also faster than a lot of these, and the mons that it isn't faster than being this one and this one and this one, it has a lot better utility for it, so like Parting Shot and Defog, so F tier. You wouldn't really run this over any Silvally typing. Togedemaru. Togedemaru is actually pretty decent. It's a really cool PU one. It's actually also pretty decent in doubles. I'm going to put it above A. No, I'm going to put it below A, right, at least. Togedemaru, weirdly enough, is pretty decent if you were looking doubles, let's say, for example. I've actually seen a few of these on the ladder, and the biggest reason, despite being such a niche thing, it's literally just worth Raichu, but it's truthfully because of the fact that it has some pretty decent utility in comparison to Raichu, and also the typing is pretty decent. You could typically run this with something like an Iron Barbs or a Lightning Rod and redirect immunity. You get options like Zing Zap, for example, which is pretty decent. You could also run this as, again, just another pivot. It gets Super Fang, which is an edge that it has over Raichu, legitimately. You still get the same utility like Eerie Impulse that a lot of electrics have mentioned. I won't act like this is some great Pokemon, but I think as well, in tandem with its PU case usage, I do want to give this a C tier. Coco's an easy top of A tier. This is like the best electric that singles has right now, and it's still decent enough in doubles, but I do think that a lot of other doubles electrics have kept up enough with this power creep to where I can't really actually justify putting this in the S tier. We went through the list. We went through all of the mons. It's not even in the top 5 anymore, which is kind of insane to think about. I will say, though, at the same time, this is still such a good singles electric, and it's still arguably usable, just so many better electrics, that I'm going to give Coco A tier. Just in singles and in doubles at least, no one really cares about the electric surge when you just max lightning, which is such a good max move in general. And even still, despite being such a good max move for electrics, it's not really valuable considering there are a lot better terrains you're running, like Misty, Grassy, and Psychic. I would argue all out value, because Misty gets the status immunity, but on every status instead of just sleep. Psychic gets an immunity of priority while boosting damage, which is a lot more valuable for a lot of teams. And Grassy's really good solely because of Rillaboom. That's really it, if we're going to be honest. It's just Rillaboom, and occasionally teams that really want to run him on that's really Earthquake weak, and that's about it. Xurgitree's up next. Xurkitree is, I'll be honest, it's kind of garbage this gen. Missing out on hidden power is huge despite having Energy Ball. I just, in general, got caught up really badly by power creep, in my opinion. It's one of those things where I will say for lower tiers it's pretty good, but sadly, no Z moves also hurts a lot because you can't really see hypnosis bullshit that you could have otherwise. I do think as well, even as far as Nadex goes, it's just kind of got caught by power creep, but it's definitely noticeably better there because of the Z sets, which shows considering it's actually higher tier despite more mons being in there. I will say I'm going to give this a solid low B tier solely because of the fact that it is good enough to get banned. But I do think that I'm going to put it actually right above these. I do think though its current usage between doubles as well as its Sword and Shield usage is enough to where I'm not going to put it higher than something like Raikou, which has consistent usage in the main meta, and I would argue as well it has more tiers it's viable in. So we'll put it around here. I think you could make a case to swap Raikou and Xurkitree, which at that point, versatility, and it's not reliant on a specific item. Zeraora is up next. Zeraora is decent. I'm actually putting this at the bottom of A. I will say that a lot of people do. I know this is definitely a typically UU electric type, but I think it's one that also has a lot of OU niche. On top of this as well, it's weirdly enough, I think, kind of viable in doubles. We've actually seen this scarfed options in terms of VGC, because it's going to go for Plasma Fist and then go for something like a self-destruct option, which we have actually seen. I've seen in one of Wolfie's streams, actually, he played this a couple times, and I've actually played it myself, where teams will run Scarf Zeraora, and they'll run it with an explosion Pokemon, because they'll go for Plasma Fist, then be immune to it, and then on top of that as well, they'll claim 2 KOs right off the spot. So it's pretty valuable in that sort of sense. I do think it's decent enough to where it's carved out of A tier niche, but it's low tier among the A's for sure. Next up is Bolton. Bolton's pretty garbage, but I will say, if nothing else, it's a pretty good PU mon for electric types. I'm pretty sure this is actually no, it's not a PU mon anymore. It was a PU mon at one point for a good amount of time. Even still, Competitive and Strongjaw are 2 pretty decent abilities. It has some decent move pool options. If nothing else, I'm going to acknowledge that I know for a fact this was PU through a lot of the gen. And on top of it as well, I think it's a decent mon in general. It's just a blanket offense. Competitive in theory could be decent for VGC, but its special moveset's just not good enough to justify that. And also just a lot better fast electrics. The Strongjaw is pretty decent with stuff like Fire Fang and Ice Fang, but and Psycho Fang too, and Crunch. I just kind of wish I got Ice Fang. If they got Ice Fang, I think you could make a case for bottom of C, but because of that, I'm gonna give it D tier. Toxtricity, really good option actually, really good breaker this gen. I'm gonna put this at the bottom of B. This is one of those mons that, in my opinion, despite its low tier usage, it's similar to the Quagsire sort of cases where this has a lot of high tier viability. This is actually being ran even in OU with mixed shift gear sets with Throat Spray, where you would run stuff like Shift Gear, Boom Burst, Overdrive, and Drain Punch. And you might be asking, why am I running Drain Punch? It's a special attacker. Well, Shift Gear already boosts your offenses enough anyway. And on top of it as well, it was solely here for the Blissey matchup, because Blissey was one of the hardest wall assist Pokemon in the game, and you could just massacre it with Shift Gear sets, and you could actually set up on it in a way where you could start massacring Blissey, drain punching back more than it was doing with Seismic Toss, and it's a pretty cool stall breaker. It's also decent in UU, and it's decent in RU. It's weirdly enough kind of niche in VGC, just not with the Gmax. The Gmax, I will say, I'm breaking my Gmax rule here solely because of the cost opportunity in tandem with the fact this is such a garbage max move and it loses a lot of potential for Tox. I'm actually going to put Tox at the bottom of F tier. And you might be wondering why. It's a Pokemon that's double HP, electric poison, it's decent offensive. And I'll ask you, what does Toxtricity's Gmax move do? If we look at the Gmax moves to this Pokemon, let me give you a guess. So if this was to lose poison, you're losing out a special attack boost every turn. That's pretty bad. If this is an electric type move, you're losing out on electric terrain, which for a grounded Pokemon, and in tandem with the fact that you just miss out on the team utility we mentioned through Max Lightning, is pretty bad. So what is Toxicity's max move? It's an electric max move. So you can not only still boost your poison stab, but it's now a weaker max option. You also can't set your own terrain, which means you can't actually make your max stun shock more viable. This is a garbage max Pokemon. In tandem with this as well, it's still slow enough speed to where you're typically not going to set up a shift gear beforehand and then go for a max. You kind of just need to get the max up first, because otherwise Tox is going to die. And specifically in doubles, I should say, in AG, where the 2 tiers that you would typically run a max Pokemon, it's not really better doing that. And even still, your damage output actually, because of overdrive, is a lot worse than max, because you could just go for stuff like choice spec sets and go for overdrive or boom burst and do more damage, because the max, especially for boom burst, weakens your damage output by a considerable amount. This is actually just a Maxmon that genuinely hurts the user. F tier. Pincurchin, pretty decent, sets electric terrain, sets spikes. If nothing else, I think solely for the spikes plus memento aspect, I'm putting it in D tier, just because of the potential to be viable. Albeit, I don't think this is actually a viable Pokemon, but it's more viable than these. At least I can name a case where it would be. Next was Morpeko. Morpeko is kind of cool. I'm going to give this F tier. I figure why I tiered it with Dark, which I know is insane. I did it a couple days ago, but I'm putting it at the very front of F tier solely for the fact that this has the Rapid Spin signature move, but I do think it's actually kind of a hindrance considering the fact that it changes types every other turn, which can in theory be bad depending on what you need to hit. Dracozolt up next. This is a solid A tier actually, and I'm putting both Dracozolt and Arctozolt in A tier right above Zeraora. Dracozolt solely for the fact that Dragozolt's better in doubles, Arctozolt's better in singles. I'm going to put Dracozolt higher though, because I think that if nothing else, Dracozolt has a much lower gap, because this is still a not bad option in singles. I think Arctozolt's pretty garbage in doubles. You're not typically running this on a Hail team. Hail's just not a viable archetype in doubles in my opinion, outside of maybe just the raw Veil that occasionally will be ran, but it's such a niche thing anyway. The support's just gotten a lot better, and typically you're opting for dual screens over Veil because the mons that run it are a lot more viable. These are still really good options though. They're both a lot more demon, especially Arctozolt, than a lot of people anticipated. I remember when this mon was in PU for several months this generation. In fact, I think it was even PU for a couple of years this generation. Regardless though, they're both really good. Finally though, we have Regieleki. Regieleki gets an S tier, above Arceus Electric, below... Actually, no, we'll put it above Zekrom. This is one of those electric types. I'm going to put it right below Thundy. And I will say it's solely for the fact that it's a lot more linear in terms of its usage. For example, if we compare this thing in doubles, this is only an offensive Pokemon unless you're running screens. I think its Thunder is a lot better support. It has a lot more varied support. Its offenses as well are not as limited in terms of coverage. You can actually hit a lot of types that would switch in on it. On top of that as well, it's better offensively as far as just not specifically electric moves go, and Aleki really is solely a stab clicker. On top of this as well, if we go into singles usage, they're both pretty similarly tiered. They're typically like OU fringe Pokemon, but if we do look at what they could actually in theory do in this sort of tier, I do think that Aleki is slightly less viable solely despite the fact that Regieleki is the one that typically does creep into the tier. And it's solely for the fact that I think there's just a lot better ground types that are typically run. And Thundurus, in theory, could actually be a good plot user to get around some of these. Well, not specifically the Landorus, for example. It could be good at least to just get around stuff like Garchomp if you were to go in a plot set and then go for like a Grass Knot. Though again, not really the best case scenario. They're both kind of garbage in this meta anyway. I think it in theory, Thundurus has better ways around its checks. On top of this as well, I think that for a team support option, Thundurus is significantly better. Prankster is a lot better of an option, and on top of it as well, Defiance great to just help maybe deter Intimidators from coming to the game. So I do think that Thundurus commands a lot more of a presence, specifically in not only the actual match, but even in the team preview than Regieleki. And I don't think it's something that Regieleki could ever actually muster unless you don't bring a ground type, which in that case is not a team preview issue, it's a team building issue. But let me know your guys' thoughts to this. Do you think this tier list is accurate? I know there's some things that I'm gonna get some comments about, specifically that Thundurus placement, and I do not fucking care. Let me know down below though. I would love to hear your arguments, and especially for the Thundurus ones, I would love to argue my case another 20 times. But if you enjoy this video, leave a like below and subscribe for more content like this. Links down below to the Twitter and Discord if you want to get up to date on future videos. And shout out to our channel members being Josh K Ultra Player, Mia, and Zeke0. If you guys want to become channel members today for only a few dollars a month, I think it's at $3 a month or maybe $4, you can become a channel member and support me monetarily. I would really appreciate it, obviously. It goes a long way for just making the channel and commissioning the graphics that we use to update our series. But with that said, I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, peace out, guys.